Growing up, I always felt like the unnecessary piece in a puzzle that was already complete. My name is Sarah, and for as long as I can remember, I was the overlooked child in a family that revolved entirely around my older brother, Ryan. He was 5 years older than me, and from the moment I entered the world, it seemed like I had disrupted the perfect balance he had created for himself. Ryan has ADHD, and while I now realize that makes life challenging, all I knew as a child was how everything in our household was centered on him, and how little anyone seemed to care about how it affected me. It started early. My parents, Linda and Frank, would often share stories about how Ryan would throw tantrums when I was a baby, because he thought I was getting too much attention. I was too young to remember, but my mom would chuckle like it was an endearing memory. Ryan just didn't like sharing us, she'd say with a smile, as if it were a charming story to treasure. To me, it felt like a warning. When I was around 4, I started noticing it for myself. Ryan didn't just dislike me. He resented me. If I played with a toy, he would grab it away, not because he wanted it, but because he couldn't bear to see me happy. Of course, I'd cry, as any 4-year-old would, but my parents would just sigh and say, "Ryan doesn't mean it. He's just overwhelmed. Be patient with him." That word, patient, was drilled into me constantly, as if I were the one who needed to be more understanding. My birthdays were the worst. For most kids, birthdays are a magical day, just for them, not for me. Ryan always found a way to ruin it. My 7th birthday stands out the most. I had a few friends over, and we were about to cut the cake. Ryan had been sulking all morning because he wasn't the center of attention. As I stood by my cake, smiling for the camera, he shoved the table so hard that the cake crashed to the floor. My friends stared in disbelief, and I looked at the mess of icing and candles smeared into the carpet. Ryan didn't even seem guilty. He crossed his arms and glared at me as if I had forced him to do it. My parents rushed to console him. "It's okay, Ryan. We'll get you some ice cream," my mom said, pulling him aside like he was the one who'd been wronged. I didn't even have time to cry before my dad began cleaning up the cake, telling me, "Don't be upset, Sarah. You know how Ryan is." That year, I didn't get another cake. My friends left early, and I spent the rest of the day alone in my room. That was when I understood something significant. My feelings didn't matter. Not to my parents. Not in our house. If I cried or spoke up, I was dramatic. If Ryan acted out, he was overwhelmed. After that, I stopped hoping for things to change. As I grew older, Ryan's behavior became worse. By the time I was 9 and he was 14, he had become stronger, meaner, and more aggressive. It wasn't just toys anymore. He'd push me aside if I was in his way, or knock things out of my hands, whether it was homework or lunch, just to show he could. Once, I was holding a drawing I had spent hours on for art class. Ryan grabbed it, crumpled it, and threw it in the trash. When I told my mom, she didn't even look up. "He's just being a big brother," she said. "You'll understand when you're older." I stood there, holding back tears, wondering what I was supposed to understand. That Ryan could treat me horribly, and I just had to accept it. It wasn't just what Ryan did that hurt. It was my parents' constant dismissal. If he hit me, they would comfort him for losing his temper. If I screamed out of frustration, they'd say I was overreacting. I'd cry in my room at night, questioning if they were right. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I was the problem. But deep down, I knew the truth. Ryan was a bully, and my parents enabled him. The memory that sticks with me the most happened when I was 10. I had been working for weeks on a science fair project, and for the first time, I felt genuinely proud of something. My teacher even mentioned I might win. I excitedly told my parents at dinner, hoping for praise. But Ryan wasn't having it. "No one cares about your stupid project," he muttered. I tried to ignore him, but I saw that familiar look in his eyes, the one that meant he was going to ruin it for me. That night, I left my project on the kitchen table. The next morning, it was gone, destroyed. The poster was torn and the model was smashed. Ryan was in the living room, watching TV like nothing had happened. "Why would you do that?" I yelled, tears streaming down my face. He just smirked and shrugged. My mom walked in, saw the wreckage, and turned to me. "Sarah, don't yell at your brother. You know how easily he gets upset." Upset? I was the one crying. I was the one who spent weeks on that project, now in ruins. But, as always, Ryan's feelings mattered more. My parents didn't scold him. They didn't even say he was wrong. Instead, my mom handed me paper towels and told me to clean up the mess. By the time I was 12, I stopped asking my parents for help. It was simpler to stay out of Ryan's way than to hope they'd support me. I grew quiet and withdrawn. My friends noticed and asked why they weren't invited over anymore. But what could I say? That my brother despised me and my parents didn't care? I couldn't explain it, so I just said I didn't feel like it. Even at school, where I should have felt free, I carried that weight. Teachers praised me for being well-behaved and mature, but that wasn't the truth. I wasn't mature. I had just gotten used to being invisible. I learned to shrink myself down and occupy as little space as possible, because that's what life with Ryan had taught me. At 12 years old, I couldn't find the words to express it, but I felt like I was suffocating. I wished for a normal family, one where siblings argued sometimes, but still loved each other. I wanted parents who saw me, who noticed when I was struggling. Instead, I got Ryan, the center of the universe, and parents who made me feel like I didn't exist. I didn't realize it at the time, but those years of feeling invisible were shaping who I would become and planting the first thoughts of my eventual escape. By the time I turned 13, I had given up on things getting better. Ryan was now 18, and with his size and age, his bullying became harder to avoid and more terrifying. It wasn't just shoving or sarcastic remarks anymore. Now it was calculated, deliberate, and always accompanied by a smug smile, as if he knew he'd never face consequences. My parents still refused to acknowledge what was right in front of them, choosing instead to defend him and dismiss everything he did. One particular day right before I started high school stands out. I was sitting at the dining table working on a summer project, my papers and notes carefully arranged. Ryan walked past, grabbed the table's edge, and, accidentally, knocked everything onto the floor. I froze, staring at my crumpled work scattered everywhere. He grinned, that infuriating smirk on his face, and said, "Oops, shouldn't have put it there." I lost it, shouting, "Why do you always do this?" Ryan just laughed and strolled out of the room. I was still picking up the mess when my mom walked in, sighed, and said, "Sarah, don't be so dramatic. I'm sure it wasn't on purpose. You know how Ryan is." That phrase, I heard it so many times it still echoes in my mind. Ryan's torment didn't stop at home. He struggled at school, too, though my parents refused to admit it. He was always in trouble for talking back to teachers, refusing to do assignments, or getting into fights. Yet, no matter what he did, my parents defended him. "Ryan is trying his best," my dad would insist whenever the principal called. "He just needs a little patience." Ryan didn't have many friends. My parents tried to force friendships by organizing playdates or inviting kids over, but it never ended well. I remember one time when I was 14, my mom invited a co-worker's son named Josh over to play with Ryan. Josh was quiet, and Ryan made fun of him for being shy before throwing a basketball at his face so hard it made his nose bleed. Josh left in tears, and my mom spent the evening apologizing to Ryan. "You didn't mean it," she kept telling him. "It's okay. You just got frustrated." She never acknowledged how much Ryan had hurt Josh. Meanwhile, I kept shrinking myself down even more. I spent most of my time in my room, reading or listening to music with my headphones on to escape the chaos of living in Ryan's shadow. At school, I became the quiet kid, the one who never caused problems. Teachers praised me for being mature, but I knew that wasn't true. I wasn't mature, I was exhausted. I didn't know how to be a kid because my whole life had been about keeping the peace. By then, I stopped trying to tell my parents how Ryan treated me. They never believed me anyway. One night, Ryan and I were watching TV in the living room. I reached for the remote to change the channel, and he yanked it from my hand so hard that I fell off the couch, hitting my head on the corner of the coffee table. I lay there, dazed and in pain, while Ryan smirked. Later, when I told my mom, she didn't even look up from her phone. "Stop provoking him," she said. "You know how Ryan gets." That night, I cried quietly into my pillow, feeling completely alone. I realized then that my parents weren't just oblivious to Ryan's behavior. They chose to ignore it. They didn't want to face the truth, so they let me suffer instead. One of the worst experiences happened when I was 16. It was supposed to be a good day. My history teacher had nominated me for a state academic award after months of hard work, and I was proud of myself. I came home, excited to share the news. My mom smiled distractedly and said, "That's nice, Sarah," before turning her attention back to Ryan, who was complaining about how unfair his teachers were. Ryan didn't say anything at first, but I noticed him watching me that evening. Later that night, he barged into my room uninvited. "Why do you always act like you're perfect?" he sneered. I didn't know how to respond, so I stayed silent. He grabbed the certificate I had left on my desk, tore it in half, and dropped the pieces at my feet before leaving. When I told my dad the next morning, he just shook his head. "You know Ryan is going through a tough time. Don't take it personally." How was I not supposed to take it personally? Ryan had destroyed something I'd worked so hard on, and my dad made me feel like I was being unreasonable. That hurt more than any shove or insult ever did. Ryan had thrown many insults my way, but this one stung the most. It was the moment I realized my parents would never stand up for me, no matter what he did. They had chosen Ryan as their priority, and I was just collateral damage. By this point, my grandparents were the only ones I could confide in. My mom's parents, Evelyn and George, showed me kindness and patience in a way my parents never did. I started visiting them more often, getting out of the house for a few hours just to breathe. My grandma would sit with me at the kitchen table, offering me tea and listening as I poured out all the feelings that had built up inside. She never interrupted or dismissed me. She just listened. One day, after I told her about Ryan destroying my award, she reached out, squeezed my hand, and said softly, "You don't deserve this, Sarah. You're not wrong for wanting more." Her words stayed with me. I realized I wasn't wrong for wanting more. I wasn't wrong for feeling hurt or for needing to be seen. For years, I had been made to believe that I was the issue, that I was too sensitive or selfish for wanting my parents to care about me as much as they cared about Ryan. My grandma's words gave me a glimmer of hope. I began to imagine a future where I could leave it all behind, a future where I didn't have to tiptoe around in my own home or diminish myself to keep the peace. I didn't know how I would do it, but I promised myself one thing. I wouldn't spend my entire life feeling this way. Somehow, some way, I would escape. For the first time in years, I believed it might actually happen. By the time I turned 17, the resentment I felt toward my family weighed on me constantly. It wasn't just about Ryan anymore. His bullying had become so routine that I expected it. What hurt more was my parents' refusal to acknowledge it. I had spent my life being an afterthought in a home that revolved around my brother, and I was done pretending I could handle it. Leaving wasn't just a desire anymore. It was necessary for my survival. I knew I had to go far away. Moving to a nearby town or attending a local college wouldn't be enough. My parents would guilt me into coming home every weekend to help with Ryan. No, I needed a clean break, a place they couldn't pull me back from. So, I started planning my escape like a strategic mission. Every night after finishing my homework, I sat at my desk researching colleges. I focused on universities in states like California, New York, and Oregon. I needed miles of distance to finally be free. I didn't tell my parents what I was doing. I couldn't risk them interfering. They would never understand my need to leave, and they definitely wouldn't support it. It didn't take long for them to notice how much time I was spending in my room. One evening, my dad knocked on my door and peeked in. "You've been quiet lately," he said, like it was out of the ordinary. "I've just been busy with school," I replied, keeping my voice calm. I didn't want to give him a reason to ask more questions. He gave me a long look, like he could see right through me, then shrugged and left. I exhaled with relief. As far as they were concerned, I was the good kid, the one who didn't cause trouble. I kept it that way because being ignored was easier than being scrutinized. I dedicated myself to my schoolwork, determined to get the grades needed for a scholarship. Our family didn't have much money, and I knew my parents wouldn't help me pay for college, especially if they found out I planned to leave. I got a part-time job at a local diner after school, saving every penny. It wasn't much, but it was mine. A few months later, with all my research complete, I started sending in applications. My heart raced every time I clicked Submit. This was my way out, my chance to escape. I didn't know if I'd get accepted anywhere, but I had to try. Eventually, the night came when I couldn't keep my plans a secret any longer. We were at the dinner table, my mom, Dad, Ryan, and me. Ryan had spent 10 minutes whining about how his teachers were making him redo an assignment he hadn't bothered to finish. My parents, as usual, sympathized with him. "They just don't understand how you learn," they said. I stared at my plate, trying to tune them out, when my dad suddenly turned to me. "Sarah, you've been awfully quiet. What's going on?" For a moment, I froze. I hadn't planned to say anything yet, but something inside me snapped. I was tired of keeping it a secret. "I've been applying to colleges," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Out of state." The room fell silent. My mom's fork clattered onto her plate. Ryan looked up from his phone, staring at me like I had announced I was moving to another planet. "Out of state?" my mom repeated, her voice sharp. "Why would you want to go so far away?" I stared at my plate. "I think it would be good for me. I want to experience something new." My dad's face darkened. "What's wrong with staying here? There are good schools close to home." I took a deep breath, preparing for the argument. "I need to get away. I need space." His expression hardened. "Space? Space from what?" Before I could answer, Ryan sneered, "She just wants to act like she's better than us." "That's not true," I shot back, my voice trembling. Despite my frustration, I managed to say, "I just want to live my own life for once." That's when my dad said something that would stay with me forever. He set down his fork, leaned forward, and said, "You know Ryan needs you here. You can't just abandon him. We've always counted on you to help take care of him." I stared at him, my stomach twisting into knots. "What do you mean, counted on me?" My dad looked at me as if I were being unreasonable. "Sarah, we've talked about this before. Ryan has his struggles, and as he gets older, he's going to need your help. That's just how it is. You're part of the family plan. Family plan. The words lingered in the air like thick smoke, suffocating me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My entire life, I'd felt like I didn't matter, like I was nothing more than a shadow behind Ryan's spotlight. Now, my dad was confirming what I'd suspected for years. I wasn't a person to them. I was just Ryan's backup plan, his safety net. My mom must have realized how deeply my dad's words had hurt because she quickly tried to smooth things over. Her voice trembled slightly as she said, "That's not what he meant. Of course, we love you. We just need you to consider what's best for the family." I couldn't look at either of them. Nausea churned in my stomach. "I'm not responsible for Ryan," I whispered. "I need to live my own life." Ryan rolled his eyes. "Selfish? Much?" I pushed my chair back and stood, my voice shaking with anger. "I'm not being selfish. I'm just done pretending that my life doesn't matter." I walked away from the table without another word, ignoring my parents calling after me. I went to my room, shut the door, and sat on my bed, trying to process what had just happened. My dad's words echoed in my mind. Family plan. It felt like my entire life had been mapped out for me without my consent. I wasn't Sarah, their daughter. I was Ryan's future caretaker. That night, I made myself a promise. I didn't care what my parents said or how difficult it would be. I was going to leave that house, that town, and everything that came with it. I wouldn't spend my life cleaning up after Ryan. I wouldn't let my family's expectations control me any longer. This was my life, and for the first time, I was determined to fight for it. The following months blurred together in a mix of determination and exhaustion. I poured all my energy into my schoolwork and my part-time job at the diner. I needed high grades for scholarships and every dollar I earned for my escape. My plan to leave became my obsession. I stayed up late studying, applied for every scholarship I could find, and took on long shifts after school. My parents barely noticed. They were too preoccupied with Ryan. He was 18 now, and though he had technically graduated high school, he wasn't doing anything with his life. My parents made endless excuses for him. "He just needs time to figure things out," my mom would say, whenever anyone questioned his lack of direction. Meanwhile, I was doing everything I could to avoid ending up stuck in our small town, drowning in excuses and false hope. That winter, acceptance letters began arriving. I vividly remember the first one. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the envelope with trembling hands. The return address read, University of Oregon. I had applied to schools all over the country, but this one was nearly 2,000 miles away, exactly what I'd dreamed of. I tore open the envelope, my heart pounding, and there it was. Congratulations. I had been accepted. For the first time in years, I felt like I could finally breathe. I held that letter as if it were gold because, in a way, it was. It was my freedom. I didn't tell my parents right away. I was terrified of their reaction. I waited until after dinner one evening, when the house was quiet, to break the news. "Mom, Dad," I said from the doorway of the living room where they were watching TV, "I got accepted to a university." My mom smiled absently. "That's great, honey. Which one?" "The University of Oregon," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I'm going to move there for school." The room fell silent. My dad muted the TV and turned to face me, his expression serious. "Oregon? That's across the country." "I know," I said. "That's where I want to go." My mom's smile faded. "Why go so far? There are good schools right here in Missouri. We can't afford out-of-state tuition. I've applied for scholarships," I said quickly. "And I've been saving money. I can make it work." My dad shook his head. "Sarah, this is ridiculous. You don't need to go that far for a degree. Think about Ryan. He relies on you. There it was again. Ryan. It was always about him. He doesn't rely on me, I snapped. You rely on me to deal with him. My dad's face hardened. You're being selfish? Ryan's going through a tough time, and you just want to run away? What kind of sister does that? A sister who's exhausted, I shot back. A sister who's been ignored her whole life because of him. Sarah, my mom said, her voice shocked, like I'd just cursed at them. I couldn't hold back any longer. You've spent my entire life making excuses for him. He's cruel and unkind, and you act like it's my responsibility to tolerate it. It's not. I deserve to live my own life, to matter. My dad looked like he wanted to argue, but no words came out. My mom started crying. We've always done our best for you. How can you say that? I shook my head, a wave of anger and sadness washing over me. If this is your best, then it isn't good enough. I'm leaving, and you can't stop me. I left the room before they could respond. Upstairs, I sat on my bed, letting the tears flow. I didn't want to feel guilty for wanting more, but it was hard not to. My whole life, I had been made to feel that my needs were a burden, that wanting to be acknowledged was selfish. But this time, I refused to back down. The next morning, my parents tried a different tactic. My mom sat beside me at the kitchen table, her voice gentle. Sarah, we're just concerned about you moving so far away. It's a huge decision. I know, I replied, but I have to do this. Her voice wavered. What about us? What about Ryan? I looked her in the eye and said what I'd held back for years. I'm not responsible for Ryan. I never have been. Her expression was one of shock, like the thought had never crossed her mind. That evening, my dad wasn't as kind. He confronted me in the hallway. If you leave, don't expect us to help you, he warned. You're on your own. I met his eyes. I've always been on my own. The following months were tough. My parents barely spoke to me unless necessary, and Ryan went out of his way to make my life miserable. He seemed to sense he was losing his control over me. One night, he blocked my bedroom door, smirking. You think you're better than us, don't you? I think I deserve better, I shot back, pushing past him. My heart raced, but I didn't let him see my fear. He wouldn't win anymore. As graduation neared, I packed my things in secret, afraid Ryan would ruin my belongings or my parents would try to interfere. My grandparents, Evelyn and George, were my support system during this time. They let me store bags at their house and promised to help me move. One afternoon, as I sat at their kitchen table, my grandpa reassured me. You're making the right choice, Sarah. There's nothing wrong with wanting more for yourself. The day I left was subdued. I planned to stay with my grandparents over the summer before heading to Oregon. My parents barely acknowledged my departure. My mom hugged me stiffly, tears on her cheeks, but she stayed silent. My dad wouldn't even look at me. Ryan didn't come out of his room. I expected to feel anger or sadness, but I didn't. As I loaded my bags into my grandpa's car, I felt a sense of freedom I'd never experienced before. I was finally choosing myself. That summer, I worked harder than ever, saving every dollar. My grandparents were incredible, letting me stay without rent and helping with my first semester's expenses. They told me they were proud of me, and for once, I believed them. When the day came to leave for Oregon, I stood by the airport gate with my grandpa beside me. He gave me one of his familiar pep talks. You've got your whole life ahead of you, Sarah, he said warmly. Don't let anyone convince you that you don't deserve it. I hugged him tightly, tears welling up. Thank you, I whispered. As I boarded the plane and looked out the window, a mix of fear and excitement filled me. I didn't know what lay ahead in Oregon, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never go back to that house or that life. My future was finally my own, and that was enough. Arriving in Oregon felt like landing on another planet. Everything was different. The air, the people, the cityscape. I had dreamed of leaving for so long that it felt surreal to finally be there. The first few days, I wandered around campus in a daze, overwhelmed by how far I was from everything familiar. Even with the excitement, it was hard. I had no safety net. My parents hadn't given me a cent, and I couldn't depend on them even if I wanted to. My grandparents had gotten me this far, and I owed them everything, but I refused to ask for more. I found a job at a nearby diner, covering late-night shifts no one else wanted. Balancing a full course load with 30-hour work weeks, I barely managed to pay for my dorm and textbooks. Some nights, I was so exhausted I could hardly move, but it didn't matter. This was my life, my freedom, my choices. The toughest realization was how unprepared I was for adulthood. My childhood had been about surviving Ryan and my parents, not learning to manage money, cook, or ask for help. I felt like a child among adults who had their lives figured out. Other students seemed carefree, talking about going home for holidays or calling their parents for advice. I had none of that. At first, I felt out of place. I wasn't the smartest, most organized, or well-dressed student. My clothes were second-hand, my textbooks had coffee stains, and I never had enough time to study as much as I wanted. But I had determination. After years of feeling invisible and being told I was second to someone else's needs, I refused to give up. Slowly, I began to find my way. I formed a few close friendships with people who knew nothing about my past and didn't expect me to shoulder anyone else's burdens. They liked me for who I was, which was a new experience for me. One friend, Claire, often sat with me in the dining hall between classes, chatting and laughing about random things. She didn't realize how much those small moments meant to me. For the first time, I felt truly seen. Yet, at night, when everything was quiet, I couldn't help but think about home. I wondered if my parents missed me, or if Ryan even noticed I was gone. Some days, the silence hurt more than I cared to admit. I thought about calling my parents occasionally, just to see if they would answer. But then I remembered all the years they ignored me and let Ryan make my life miserable. The first few months flew by, and soon winter break arrived. While other students packed their bags to go home, I remained on campus. I had nowhere to go. My grandparents called to check on me, and I reassured them that I was okay, even though I spent much of that break feeling more alone than ever. To distract myself, I picked up extra shifts at the diner. When the new semester began, I threw myself back into my studies. Slowly but surely, things started to improve. Every time I aced a test or completed a long, tiring double shift, I felt a sense of accomplishment. Each dollar I saved and every assignment I turned in on time was proof that I could manage on my own. Eventually, I stopped wondering if my parents would call and stopped waiting for an apology that would never come. It hurt to acknowledge it, but they made their choice when I left. They chose Ryan, and I chose myself. It wasn't until almost a year later that I heard anything about what was happening back home. One evening, my grandma called, which she only did when something important happened, so I knew something was wrong. "Sarah, your parents are having a rough time," she said gently. "Ryan's behavior has gotten worse." "What happened?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. My grandma sighed. "He's been causing problems in the neighborhood. Your parents finally woke up when the police got involved. He was yelling at some kids and throwing things at them, and one of the parents called the cops. He got arrested." I was speechless. Part of me felt relieved that maybe my parents would finally realize Ryan's behavior couldn't be ignored anymore, but another part of me felt sadness. Ryan had always acted like the world owed him, and now it had caught up with him. "What did Mom and Dad do?" I asked. "They bailed him out, of course," my grandma replied. "But the court ordered him to go to therapy. Your parents are having trouble paying for it. Your mom mentioned it to me recently, and I think they plan to reach out to you soon." My stomach sank. I hadn't spoken to my parents in over a year, and I didn't want to hear from them now, especially not to be pulled back into their problems. "What did you say?" I asked. "I told her not to expect you to fix everything," my grandma said firmly. "You've done enough, Sarah. It's not your job." Her words brought tears to my eyes. She understood what my parents never did. I had spent my life being patient, being the good child, and carrying responsibilities that weren't mine. I wasn't going to do it anymore. A few days later, the call I had dreaded came. My dad's number flashed on my phone screen, and for a moment I thought about ignoring it. But against my instincts, I answered. "Hello?" I said cautiously. "Sarah, it's Dad," he said. His voice sounded older and more worn out than I remembered. "How are you?" I didn't know how to respond to that question from him. "I'm fine," I replied flatly. "What do you want?" He sighed, sounding disappointed. "Your mom and I have been talking. We think it's time to put everything behind us. We miss you, Sarah. We want to make things right." I stayed quiet, waiting for the real reason he was calling. "Sure enough," he continued. "The truth is, Ryan's having a hard time. He's gotten into trouble, and we're trying to get him help. But therapy is expensive. Since you're doing well now, we thought you could help us out financially until we get back on track." I felt like I'd been punched. After all this time, they were only reaching out because they needed something from me. Clutching the phone, I firmly replied, "No." "Sarah, please," he said. "You know how hard this has been for us." "I don't care," I snapped. "Ryan isn't my responsibility, and I'm not going to clean up the mess you made. You ignored everything he did, and now you're facing the consequences. That's not my problem." I hung up before he could reply. My hands trembled, but I felt lighter than I had in years. I had finally stood my ground. That night, my mom sent a long text full of apologies and promises to change, but I didn't respond. I had spent my whole childhood waiting for them to be different, and they never were. I wasn't going to fall for it again. I wasn't angry anymore. I was free.